Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second ICPC 2022 keynote session. My name is Sonia Hajduk, and I will be moderating this session. And I'm extremely delighted to introduce our keynote speaker today, Ciera Jaspan. And Ciera is the tech lead manager of engineering productivity research within developer infrastructure at Google. And Ciera and her team bring a data-driven approach to business decisions around engineering productivity by using a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods to triangulate on measuring productivity. And Ciera previously worked on Tricoder, Google's static analysis platform. She received her Bachelor's of Science in Software Engineering from Cal Poly and her PhD from Carnegie Mellon, where she worked with Jonathan Aldrich on cost-effective static analysis and software framework design. So Ciera, without further ado, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Sonia. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'll be presenting today a little bit on what my team does within Google. So just a quick bit about who I am. I'm a senior staff software engineer at Google, and the team I work on is a cross-functional team that was designed to understand engineering productivity and try to figure out how do we improve our developer tools. So we do sit within the developer tools group, and our team was designed to be a mixed methods team from the start. So we have a mix of software engineers, UX researchers, and data scientists, among other roles, that try to all come together to understand what it means to make an engineer productive and to advise our tooling, framework, and process teams for how to improve productivity through making improvements to their tools and processes. I took the team from originally 4 people. This is what we started with, and now we have 20 people on the team. The teammates come from a really wide variety of areas, so we don't have just software engineering researchers, but some of my teammates come from fields as diverse as neuroscience, behavioral economics, statistics, engineering, public policy, industrial psychology. We've got all of these different fields represented within one team. And we build out also infrastructure to automate as much of what we do as possible so that we can scale even further beyond just having 20 of us. And my apologies, I'm going to be coughing a little bit. I am still in recovery from COVID. So I will do my best, but I'm probably going to be talking a little slower than I normally do and taking a few more breaks. So ultimately, what our team does is we try to answer questions across Google to figure out how to improve developer productivity. So things like when a team has a new tool and they want to know, is this tool going to improve productivity, or is this feature going to improve productivity or hurt productivity? We help them figure out how to answer that. We also try to help them understand where people's roadblocks are and where we need better tools or better processes. So this is kind of a sampling of questions that we either have looked at or are actively looking at right now. So to start, just what I'm talking about today, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of our overall approach and then spend a lot of time on how we actually build and validate our metrics. Because I think that's where some of the really interesting and unique parts of what we do are. I've got 2 practical applications to show you how we use our metrics to actually improve the tools and processes. And then I have a little piece here about code quality, which is, I've been spending the last couple of years really doing a deep dive into understanding code quality metrics. And one of the things I found interesting, would love to give back to this community, is that I spent a lot of time on a literature review, and some of it came from ICPC. So I wanted to show you how you were able to help me. And then a couple of requests for new topics that are right for research. So our overall approach, I can sum up though as there's not one single metric to measure productivity. And as much as I know, like, the VPs above me would love to have one metric that tells them whether or not Google developers are being productive on a given day or with a given tool, there is not one metric. This is because metrics are always only a proxy, right? We all understand this, that they are a proxy, and sometimes a very poor one, of the actual underlying phenomenon. Additionally, when we measure only a single metric, it makes us just so much more likely to run into Goodhart's law and defeat then the entire purpose. And we don't want to do that. we want to make sure that the metrics that we're using are long lasting and continue to have value. So we always produce not a single metric. Our team started calling it a basket of metrics. For any particular problem, we're looking at not just one thing, but multiple metrics to try to triangulate around productivity. And we triangulate actually on two different axes. So the first axis we look at is measuring across multiple factors of productivity. And so we've broken down productivity into speed, ease, and quality. If you've seen a prior presentation of mine, we actually used to use something called the quants framework, which was 5 factors. It's a little bit more detailed and fine-grained than speed, ease, and quality. We found speed, ease, and quality more recently to just be a lot simpler to explain to people. And this is not unique to us. Our colleagues over at Microsoft use the SPACE framework, similar concept, try to break down productivity into the subcomponents. So the factors we look at though are first, like speed, how fast are developers getting new features out to customer? How fast are they working? How fast are they able to complete a change list, which is Google's equivalent to a pull request? How fast are they able to review those change lists? Ease is just simply how easy is it for that developer to achieve their goals and how satisfied are they with their work? And quality is looking at everything from code quality to product quality. How reliable are products? How performant are they? How usable are they? And a little bit about how maintainable are they as well, which does somewhat get back into speed. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later about how those are connected up. The other thing we do is we triangulate across multiple methods. We've definitely found that while quantitative methods are nice, they provide you with the scale at which some phenomenon is happening, and they tell you what is happening. They don't tell you the why. So this is why we spend a lot of time working on qualitative methods as well. So certainly most people, when they think about data-driven decision-making, they're thinking about quantitative methods. How frequently is something happening? What's the scale at which it's happening at? And this provides things like statistical significance. But what we've definitely found within Google is that if we don't have the qualitative methods, quantitative methods don't get us anywhere. Because you end up with some numbers and you go, well, what's next? What do I do about this? Is this even a problem in the first place? And qualitative methods provide that context. They provide us understanding of whether or not something is even an issue. And they also are where we find all of the actionable next steps, so that when our executives ask us, well, what do I do about this? We're able to say, this is what's recommended. We find all that comes out of our qualitative methods. So we need both these types of data to understand this. And we actually have, well, we do use a wide variety of methods. We do anything from interviews, experience sampling, surveys, diary studies, plus all of our logs analysis. There's really 2 methods that we spend most of our time on, 2 metrics that we spend most of our time on. We have a large-scale survey that we use, and then we have some developer activity metrics. So I'm going to talk about those 2 since they are the ones that we kind of routinely come back to. And in all cases, what we're doing is we end up validating everything we do against human experience. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is our survey. This is how we capture developer sentiment. As I said, we want to capture the developer's subjective experience because that does provide the context and meaning for our logs-based metrics that we're going to use. This provides us with next steps that can be taken and helps us sometimes with understanding relative priorities of problems that developers are having. So we do this through a survey we call EngSat. This is a quarterly survey. We sample 1/3 of engineers at Google on a rotating basis. So every engineer gets the survey every 9 months. And we get about a 30 to 40% response rate. It's not as high as I would like it to be, but it's pretty good as surveys go. And this gives us thousands of responses a quarter. The survey is long, which is why there's only 30 to 40% response rate. We have hundreds of questions. Now, not all developers see all questions. We've got logic early on in the survey to determine what kind of development people do. And then we show them only certain blocks based upon what type of development they do. There's additionally some blocks that we rotate between. So for example, we have a block on debugging and we have a block on refactoring, and we frequently set it up so that each developer only sees one of those 2 blocks. We just randomly select between them. The survey also includes multiple free response items where we just ask developers to give us more thoughts on things. our developers do write a lot here. I have seen 5-paragraph essays in our free response items, which we do read and use that to help understand how to improve things. I should mention too, we use a tool called Tacit. I don't know if how many of you are familiar with it, but it's how we do open coding on our free response items. The questions themselves range from very high level to very detailed. So we have some questions about overall productivity. How satisfied are you with your experience as a developer at Google? We have other questions that are very specific about their satisfaction with a particular tool or a particular task. The focus of all of these questions, though, is for us to improve the tools, frameworks, and processes. So we don't ask people about their managers or their colleagues. This is not for performance reviews. We do ask some questions along the lines of how well people are collaborating with their colleagues. The goal of those questions, though, is coming back to, can we improve collaboration through improving the tools and improving the processes? When we report out the results, we're reporting out, most of the survey items are on a 5-point scale. So we report out top 2s versus bottom 3s. And for multi-select items, just the percentage of people who selected an item. We do aggregate by a whole bunch of different dimensions. So we aggregate by org, by developer type, level and tenure at the company, programming language, the tools used, and we even do cross slices with other items on InchSet. But of all of these, by far the one we have found to be the most interesting is developer type. So that is this engineer a server developer? Are they self-identifying as a web developer, a machine learning developer, Android app developer, things like that? It's the one that seems to have the most differentiation between scores for different items. It's also the one that we have the most control over because we actually control the tools and processes. So this is the one that we spend most of our time looking at. But we do have the other ones so that we can use them if we need that. So that's our primary way of capturing sentiment. We also, though, try to look at the developer's actual behavior. What are they doing in practice while they're coding? Now, most of our developer tools are developed in-house, and Google is excellent at logging and doing logs processing. And nearly all of our developer tools are actually using the same development stack. So this provides us with a really unique opportunity to understand developers' behaviors across tools. So we are capturing the logs from all of this tools. So you see here on the slide, everything from our IDE to every click in the code review tool, every file save people make, every click in the code browsing tool, all the command line tools, that's all being collected. And we backfill as well with information from several other products like Gmail and Calendar, Drive and Meet, not because we can control those tools and actually improve them because we're sitting in the developer tools group, but this helps us understand where people's time is going. How much time are they spending in Gmail and in Calendar and meetings versus doing development work? So this helps us kind of fill the empty gaps. Before I go much farther, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about privacy. This is all in, we've got a paper in communications with the ACM. If you haven't seen that, this is all listed there as well. But it's worth noting we don't use any of this data for performance reviews. That is not the purpose of any of this data collection or what our team does. Our goal is not to ever look at engineer A is a better engineer than engineer B. That's not actually helpful for us to find that information out. Our goal is instead to figure out how do we improve the developer tools so that we improve everybody's productivity regardless of where their baseline is. So we're never trying to compare one person to another. All data when we report out is always aggregated. We can aggregate to groups of at least 10. And we also, I should mention, don't allow people to even look at their own data for fear that it might get back into a performance review tool in some way. So people aren't even allowed to see their own data. They're certainly not allowed to see their reports data. So with that, so you can imagine with all these logs that we're pulling in, every single developer has a kind of stream of events of what they've done that day. They've come in, they check their email, they go to the code review tool, they start clicking around in there and reviewing things. They go switch to their IDE and start coding. They go to their code browsing tool. And so you can kind of imagine every developer is having this stream of events that make up their day. And some of these events have what we call a task identifying artifact. They are associated with a change list, for example, or they are associated with a file or a bug. And so we mark those as different. And then we group up events into sessions based upon their task identifying artifacts. So when we see someone switch between artifacts, they switch from reviewing one CL to another CL, that breaks us into 2 sessions. We also always put Gmail events into their own session because we can't really tell like what a developer is working on in that case. There are some events that don't have a task. So when they're just looking at, for example, documentation, we don't know which task they're working on, but we try to put that near with the same session as other events that do have the same task. And if there's an ambiguity, we can't tell which one it is, we'll put them into their own session. And finally, if there's a break of more than 10 minutes, we don't see anything from someone, we say, well, they were probably on a break, getting coffee, getting lunch, whatever, so that we break sessions and leave a gap there as well. And that 10-minute number, by the way, we used to use just as a heuristic that I made up, but we have since validated that as being a reasonable time range. Now that we have these sessions, what we can do with them is we can actually build more interesting metrics from that. So for example, sessions that are with an edit in them, someone's done a file save, are tagged as active coding time. And the entire session is associated with that change list, not just that one point in time where they made a file edit, but the whole thing, which means we're not capturing just the time spent editing their code in the IDE, but we're also spending the time spent reading documentation and searching for examples, understanding their test results in the test browser, and even posting for help on our internal version of Stack Overflow. All of this would be captured in one of those, that same session, and so then gets tagged in as this is the developer actively coding on that CL. Similarly, we have 2 other metrics that we've made called active reviewing time and active shepherding time. Similar to active coding time, we are looking for sessions where someone's used our code review tool after the change list is under review, but before it's submitted. The sessions where it's being done by the reviewer are reviewing time, those done by the author are shepherding time. And again, this means that it's not just the time spent in the code review tool. Shepherding time is the time where the author is in the code review tool responding to comments, but also looking up documentation and editing their code in response to those comments. That's all going to be included. So it's a larger picture of what's actually happening across multiple tools. Now, all of these metrics, what we do is we validate them against the diary studies, our diary studies. And this is because we can't tell for sure that our heuristics are actually correct. We're making an assumption otherwise there. So we regularly recruit engineers to track time of what they're doing during a day. And so these engineers will write down every few minutes, they write down in a spreadsheet what they're doing, why they're doing it, anything we can get from them. And they're recording this throughout the one day. Most of the time when we recruit people, it's only a 1 or 2 day thing. So it's not too onerous for them. And then the researchers on our team code their responses based upon the type of task they're doing. And we've got a tool that lets us compare the diary studies to their developer logs. And this allows us to identify a couple things. The first is just looking at how well our metrics correspond with the developer's own perceptions of what they were doing. And it also allows us to identify what types of work we're missing. What are the tools that we still need to go instrument to fill in more missing gaps? So this is a screenshot from our tool. This is not real data. This is like just some fake data we made up for purposes of presenting. And you can see that the light colored bands are the places where the developer has said, this is what I'm doing. So we have this light blue band here that says the developer said they were coding right there. And the dark blue band underneath it is where our logs thought that they were coding. So we can easily visualize this and see how well, or in the green case over here, how off we might be. And to kind of make this a little bit more rigorous, we don't just visualize it, we also look at the actual agreement scores. So we use PABAC as our agreement metric. In PABAC, -1 is perfect disagreement and 1 is perfect agreement. So we're seeing a -1 to 1 scale here. Now, even within that though, it's really hard to tell like what's 0.7 mean, is that good enough? So to determine that, we use norm referencing. So meeting and email are the 2 times that we have that are intuitively the simplest to understand and also have the simplest logs. We feel fairly confident that our diary studies are probably as close to correct as they could be for those, and that our logs are probably as close as correct as they could be. So we're going to consider those kind of de facto high agreement, and those have a 0.74 and a 0.84 in this particular diary study. From that, we're able to say that our reviewing time metric is actually highly accurate. It's a 0.81, so that's really good. And our coding time metric is reasonably accurate, 0.69. So in addition to letting us evaluate those metrics, this also allows us to continue to experiment with these heuristics. So for example, I mentioned that we have a 10-minute break right now that says if you've had 10 minutes, then we're going to time you out, and that's like the start of a new session. I originally just picked that because I thought 10 minutes seemed like a reasonable number, but we hadn't evaluated it until this last year, where now we have this system. We can say, oh, let's try rerunning the entire system now, but with a 30-minute break. Let's try it with a 5-minute break. Let's try it 15 minutes. And let's see which of these actually looks most accurate compared to the diary studies. And this allowed us to determine that, yes, 10 minutes was actually a pretty good number for this. Sorry. So this allows us, though, to try, because we have both of our sentiment data and our behavior data, this now allows us to triangulate across these to better understand developer productivity. And we have 2 common methods that we use here. The first is that we try to predict survey responses based on our logs-based metrics. And then we also do a panel data analysis to look at correlations for trends. So as an example of the predictive method, we looked at our NSAT results, and we had a question there about asking people how satisfied they are with their project's velocity. And it's again 5-point scale. Are you very satisfied to very dissatisfied? And we can predict satisfaction based upon multiple of our logs-based measures. So if we look at people's average number of submitted CLs per week, their median active coding time per CL, their median wall clock reviewing time per CL, that's the time from the time when the developer asked for a review to the time when they were able to submit the CL, and then the number of lines of code per week. And those 4 were able to very accurately predict people's self-reported developer velocity. And that gives us a lot of confidence in both our subjective metrics and our objective measures. So a couple practical applications of how we've used this. The first one we did is looking at readability. So at Google, we have a process called readability. In order to submit code at Google, either the author or the reviewer of the code has to be effectively blessed in a programming language. They have to have had approval to be able to get that code submitted. And there's a process by which you get approvals for this. So for example, I have approvals for readability in Java and Go myself. It takes some time to go through this process. You have to have someone else review your code for a certain length of time, and at some point they say, yes, you're good enough at this language. You no longer need to have someone looking over your shoulder to show that you can write idiomatic Java. It was a contentious process. There were some people at Google who felt that, including myself actually, who felt that maybe this was a bygone era, and with having more static analysis tools, perhaps we don't need readability anymore. And then maybe this was now just kind of a hazing process that we were keeping around for no real reason. So we examined the actual individuals who went through the readability process and looked at their median shepherding time and median reviewing time to see, does this actually improve, or are we just wasting people's effort here? And we collect the data before, during, and after the review process. And you can see in this chart here that while people are during the readability process, their reviewing and shepherding times goes up. That's expected, because they're going to have extra reviews during that time. And then it goes down afterwards because they're going to have fewer reviews. So that tells us something's happening, but this is not right now controlling for any other factors. But when we control for those factors, what we do find is actually readability was really helpful. We did a linear regression where we controlled for the author's tenure, the number of reviewers they had, and the size of the CL. And an author after readability, that's associated with a 4.5% lower review times for C++, and it's about a 10% lower shepherding time for both Java and C++. And this resulted in a decision at Google to actually keep the process and improve it further rather than abandon it. And so we have since improved it. It's a much, much faster process to get through. It's much less onerous. And no one seems to be arguing about whether readability is worthwhile anymore because of that. As another example, we have a new version control system that developers are able to use at Google. It is compatible with our existing version control system, and it's based on Mercurial. It does take a little more time to learn. It's a little bit more complex than our old one, but the major benefit is it allows developers to chain their CLs together so that they can create a couple CLs and send the first few on the chain out for review. And while they're being reviewed, continue working on the same chain. And it's supposed to make this process easier. So you can keep working, you're not blocked as much. And the goal of this was to encourage more and smaller CLs, which would be faster to review. Now, because this system was written with the idea of making the CLs smaller and faster to review, we know that there's going to be a lower lines of code per change list, and we know there's going to be more change lists per engineer for those who are reviewing that, for those who are using this tool. So just simply looking at like, oh, number of CLs has gone up, that's not necessarily saying that we've improved productivity. What we're hoping to change for this is that the active reviewing time per CL normalized by the lines of code should actually be changing. That should be reducing. And we're hoping to see an increase in the number of lines of code people are able to produce overall. So we went ahead and looked at this. We used a matched longitudinal analysis. We identified new adopters within a 6-month window. So we had 1 month of kind of baseline data from before they started using the new system, 6 months of exposure where they're learning it, and then 1 month of follow-up. And we're comparing the baseline to the follow-up. And we compared those people against those who did not adopt. And we matched for level, tenure, and the amount of coding that they do, because we had a theory that maybe this is actually only helpful for people who do significantly more coding. And we repeated the matching with different random seeds. Due to the very skewed distribution of lines of code, the analysis was entirely done with log lines of code, but we did see that log lines of code per week increased by 15% for these users compared to the non-users. And the active reviewing time per log line of code decreased by 20% for these users compared to 6.8% for the non-users. And this again results in decision to not only further put more resources towards this system, but to actually teach it as part of onboarding for new engineers at Google. So let me just check my time real quick. We are great. So I wanted to switch gears just a little bit and talk about a project I've been working on code quality and some of the literature I've been looking at from this. So code quality became very important to us a couple years ago because we had done a panel data analysis on our EngSat data to explore what correlates with self-reported developer velocity. So we actually started with looking at a speed metric. How fast are people saying that their project is moving along? And we were looking at when someone says that the panel data analysis is looking at the same cohort of people from one run of EngSat to the next, so 9 months apart. And we're looking at would people have a response in the first run and their response again 9 months later, is that number higher or lower than it was before? Are they more satisfied or less satisfied? And if they are more satisfied, what else were they more satisfied with? What correlated for that one individual? So we looked across our data and we saw that across everything we had, there were several items that were correlated, but self-reported code quality actually seemed to be the largest contributor to developer velocity. So that made it very interesting for us. And we started looking at, well, how do we measure code quality? And the problem we have here is that our subjective measure that we have on EngSat, it's not ideal. It's a lagging indicator. By the time someone responds on EngSat saying like, oh, I don't think my code quality is that great, well, it's only once a quarter. It's already bad code quality. This is way too late for us. It's also not very granular. We can't use that for identifying hotspots in the code base. All we can see is that some engineers said that they don't think their code quality is good. It doesn't tell us which file is bad or which set of files. And this is really expensive if we want to capture a more subjective measure at scale in general. So we kicked off a multi-phase study to try to figure out, can we get an objective measure for code quality? So we want to understand if developers even have a shared definition, first of all, and how they might value code quality differently. We especially want to know on whether team members agree about the code quality of their files, because if they don't agree on code quality, we have no hope of making an actual objective metric, because they're just going to argue about it. But if they do agree, we want to find out, are there any code quality metrics that actually correspond with developer perceptions? So that was kind of the goal of this whole piece of work. But before we kicked off onto that, we want to find out what's already been done in the rest of the world. What's the state of our external research? So I went through and searched for a bunch of top-ranked papers. I searched with the following 4 keywords here: cyclomatic complexity, code comprehension, test coverage, and socio-technical congruence. Just tried to pick some keywords that would get me different parts of the code quality space. And I would grab some research papers, try to kind of classify what type of paper it is, understand it a little bit, and then looked up the references and citations for it, and then continued to repeat this process, looking up more references and citations until I started getting the same papers, and also until I was just bored of reading papers. So I want to clarify, this is not like an accurate distribution of papers in the field. It is the papers that I found interesting and were interesting for my purposes. But what this got me was I ended up reading 83 papers. Most of these were in some form of empirical evaluation. I was aiming for empirical evaluations. The evaluations I found were definitely more varied than I was expecting as far as the methods being used. However, most did not involve human subjects, which I was particularly disappointed by, because I was trying to understand, do developer perceptions map to code quality metrics? I did, however, see a lot of really great work using real world projects. Very few evaluations were using fake projects. So looking at what these evaluations were trying to correlate, though, I looked at for each, so I kind of made a mapping here of, they were trying to correlate their code quality metrics with something, with reported defects or task completion rates. So I kind of made that mapping, so we can see here that actually 53 papers were trying to correlate code quality metrics to reported defects. 6 papers were reporting code quality metrics to developer perceptions. Papers can appear multiple times in this graphic. But what you see here is there's really kind of 2 clusters of papers that were interesting. And the first cluster is what I'm going to call the Defect Prediction community. Looking across these papers were really trying to predict which code files are the most risky. And the underlying theory they have here is that higher reported defects, either pre or post-release, correlates with having lower code quality. Most of the methods used here are mining large-scale repositories. So there's a lot of papers here from like the MSR community. There's a few studies looking at maintenance costs, trying to understand, these were all from contracting firms where they were actually having time cards on change requests, so they actually had that level of granularity. A few of them were using some nonlinear methods like for prediction, but most of them were using linear methods. And in general, for these papers, they showed the value of a new metric by adding it to a model and reporting on the improvement to precision and recall for predicting defects. That was kind of the general theme I was seeing. The other cluster, though, was basically the Icpc community. This was where the goal is to understand what metrics correlate with programmer comprehension, with the theory that increasing comprehension of code will reduce defect rates and maintenance costs. Many of the methods here were lab studies, nicely on both professionals and students. I was happy to see that. Understandably, the biometrics and task completion studies tend to have much lower end count. That's just, cost of doing business with those types of studies, though. Most of the developer perceptions were gathered from simply a survey, And I did find 2 studies that looked at inter-rater reliability between developers, which I was excited to find, because that's kind of where I was trying to look at, is that do developers agree with things, and developer perceptions then correlate with code quality metrics. So from this whole set, though, what this allowed me to do is come up with, well, here's all the metrics people have looked at in academia and in research previously. And have they been able to figure out, is this metric an accurate proxy of code quality? And so that let me figure out, which of these metrics am I going to look at? We found that some of these were clearly a yes, some of them were a no, some of them we had, like this last one here on change metrics was interesting because it was actually correlated based upon those 4 studies, but unfortunately it wasn't going to be helpful at Google because we don't have an option of not doing code review, for example. So what this did for us overall is it helped us identify which metrics we want to consider, which ones we shouldn't bother exploring. And it helped me refine kind of what methods I'm using in my studies. Actually finished that work. I need to publish on it, but helped us refine the methods we're using this in the studies and provided some additional indicators for how one might create a useful code quality metric if we can't find a good one. One of the things I really enjoyed was looking at some of these papers that looked at how developers comprehend code. And you could see how the existing metrics aren't actually measuring what the developer is thinking, but you could see the way that one might create a metric based upon that. I have here, by the way, a list of papers that of the 83 that I read, these were the 13 I kept coming back to, that I found that every time when I presented about this work and what I was doing to other people at Google and they would ask questions, the answer was always in one of these papers. I bolded 2 of them here that are from Icpc. So thank you very much for that. I have sent this list to people all across the company. Several people have read these papers and have asked further questions about them and have been trying to figure out how do we create a better code quality metric based upon what we've learned from this community. And finally, I have a request for additional topics I would love to be able to do this kind of literature review on and get a head start on my own research. So the 3 areas that I've been thinking about lately. The first is recommendation systems. We've been talking a lot about recommendation systems, as you can imagine, at Google. We're big into machine learning. We're big into software development tools. And I know the research community has, in general, been trying to throw machine learning on everything. We're producing so much machine learning for software engineering. But I have a lot of questions about how developers actually interact with recommendation systems and where the greatest opportunity is. If we're going to put machine learning on something, machine learning tools are expensive to run. They are expensive for people to understand the results from. So where is the greatest opportunity? Where do people actually need help? Let's not just throw ML on literally anything, but let's target it towards the places where we can actually improve developers' lives the best. The next question I have is about feature traceability. So how do we track features across the software development lifecycle? From the very first time when a product manager says, hey, I'd like to add this widget to my app, to the point where that widget is being used by actual users. How do we track everything that happened along that? Everything from the requirements docs, the design docs, codes, and code and tests, and do so in a way that's not overly cumbersome for developers. So can we semi-automate some of this so that you can just detect, oh, hey, this code is associated with this feature. And if we could do this, it would help us out a huge amount, partly for just normal traceability reasons of knowing that, yes, we're testing everything that we talked about in our requirements documents, but also for purposes of measurement. How long does it take for us to develop a feature from ideation to the point where it's actually out in the world being used by people? It also helps for us to do with compliance as well. So I'd love to see more in this area. I haven't seen as much as I would like. The final one, not too surprisingly, is on collaboration, especially with the future of hybrid work. We are very interested in how developers collaborate. What's the difference between a remote worker who is the only remote worker on their team versus someone who is on a team that half the people are remote workers versus someone who is on a 100% team? Are there any productivity differences? And are there ways we can combat those differences through improving our developer tools and processes? I'm also curious about Conway's Law. how much does our collaboration actually get reflected in our software architectures? And do things like reorgs affect this at all? When a VP switches around their teams underneath them and in theory, changes the collaboration pathways, do those collaboration pathways actually change? And if they do, over the long term, does that actually affect our software architecture? Or does it cause friction? And in what cases can we identify maybe a good reorg from a bad reorg? Can we better understand how people collaborate and how that matches to their software architectures? So with that, I will take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ciera, for that wonderful talk. A lot of food for thought there, and thank you, especially for making it here and giving the keynote despite still recovering from COVID. You're a real trooper. So really, thank you so much for that. And we're open for question. And I see Venera is very eager. She's been telling me all session, I want to ask a question. I want to ask a question. So I'm gonna let her ask the first question. Go ahead, Venera.
Thank you, Ciera, so much. It was a great talk. I really appreciate the detailed picture that you painted, in the process that you followed in your team and everything that you have done, all the steps, etc. I think this is really helpful. One thing, and I'll start with a general comment. One thing that was really interesting to see is that, you say, we only have 30 to 40% response rate. And in the research community, we're like, we really hope we'll have at least 20% response rate, and we're really praying for that 20% so hard. So it's really highlight, I think, the strength and weaknesses of the two communities, right? Research, the research community and the industrial, the research, but on the industrial side. So with that general comment, and we again, from all the processes and details that you gave us that you followed in your team, I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what type of research. So the topics that you lined out are awesome. I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what type of papers you would be willing to see, or we would be happy to see, or you want the community to focus on in order to help and to strengthen that collaboration between industry and research, in the sense that, as you said, right, you have the people that you can use to evaluate all of those, but you probably don't have the time or the resources to work on more of a maybe theory side of the metrics, etc. So what is it that you find really interesting in the when you're reading papers from the Icpc communities, and how do you select those papers that you say, I want more of those, I want people to focus on that, not in terms of topic, but right, maybe research methods, maybe what kind of papers you're looking for?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, let me go back and look at that list here again. There are a couple types of papers that types of research that I can't do myself. Some of the ones have been things like, like this one here about how programmers read regular code using eye tracking. That was actually a really great paper, because that's the type of thing that it would have, I suppose I could have done that at Google, but it would have been a lot of work to do this for me. Partly because I'm not an eye tracking expert, although I have access to such people. But the way this work was set up, it would have been much more difficult for me to understand, to be able to run this at Google. And this was one of the ones that helped me be able to say, like, oh, this is giving me ideas for how we can make a better code quality metric. Because it didn't just report back like, here's what people do with their eye tracking study. It was explaining the difference between this idea of irregular code versus irregular code, and the idea that we could maybe make a metric that tries to identify regular code. That was really powerful. So I found that to be a really great paper for that reason. A lot of the other papers that look at, it is actually helpful when I find papers that look across different projects at different companies, because it just gives me a better sense of, is this going to generalize, and is it worth looking at within Google? And I can always take, certain assumptions about, like, I can generally assume if something's working in another equivalent company to Google, that it's going to work within Google. And I kind of know the differences between our development processes and can figure out whether that's going to work out. So that's okay. Yeah, generally speaking, I'm looking though for papers really that are going to answer my questions and are answering the big questions that I have. I'm not looking as much for papers that are incremental improvements. I think that's really a big thing for me, is that if it's just a small improvement on something else, I don't care as much, because my context at Google is going to be so different than the context in which a researcher is working in. That incremental improvement may or may not be meaningful for me. So I'm looking for really papers that are unique and different and answering a big important question. I will, by the way, say the 30 to 40% response rate, you mentioned that. Yeah, it is even high and surprising within Google. Our UX researcher, the first time we had a researcher get that kind of response rate, was just amazed. She could not believe it. And we've even had some surveys that have had 70%, depending upon the topic of the survey. And I think part of the reason why we get those high response rates is because we are a known and trusted entity within the company. So all the engineers know who we are, they know what type of work we do, and they see the results. They see that if they respond to this survey and they complain about something, we have plenty of evidence showing, because you all complained about this, that change happened 6 months later, and the tool teams actually prioritized it. And because they can see that happening, it means that they trust us to actually represent their beliefs up to the tool teams and to the executive audience as well. I think there's a bunch of other questions I'm seeing in the chat, so maybe jump over those.
Matthew is next, I think. Go ahead.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, good. Thank you for the great keynote. You basically compare different code quality metrics. And I tried to look at it briefly, but it seemed like all the code-based code quality metrics were the worst that we can use. So yeah, I'm trying to wrap my head around that. Is there such a thing as an actual code quality, or is it more the process quality? I can even say, yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, like, could we even say that some code is better than other code, if there's not such a thing as an code quality independent of the process?
It's a great question. And yeah, there is, where's the paper? Here, number 13 is here. How and why process metrics are better. That paper just kind of sums up the entire situation of code metrics versus process metrics, because process metrics were routinely showing up as more likely to correlate with lower defect rates. That being said, I think there is something. I think there could be a good code quality metric. I think the problem is that our community has been kind of sidelined by cyclomatic complexity as being a code quality metric. And all the papers pretty universally show that cyclomatic complexity isn't actually measuring code quality. And that's where I come back to papers like this one on how programmers read regular code, because it's a pretty clear example of why cyclomatic complexity, sometimes you can have code that has very high cyclomatic complexity, but it's very regular and understandable and comprehensible. But you can have other code that is irregular, but has low cyclomatic complexity because it's doing something unexpected. And so I do think there is an existence of a real code quality metric. When you talk with developers, there's always that one code file that everyone shudders with. So I had one of my colleagues and I were arguing about this at one point, and he told me that he doesn't think people agree on code quality. And I happened to know his code base, and I said, how about AST helpers? And he goes, ugh. Because it's that file. It's that one where if someone says, oh, there's a bug in it, and everybody goes, oh, I don't want to work on that file, because it's just ugly code, and we all can agree to that. So there's something there. There's something that we're all thinking about in our brains, and I think we can create a metric that reflects what we're thinking. We just haven't done so yet.
Yeah, thank you.
I think that connects very well to a comment that Peggy posted. She unfortunately had to go to a meeting, but she said that, well, first of all, she said she'll connect with you later, Ciera, on the quality topic. She says they did a study on how developers define quality, and it was quite varied, actually. She put the link to the paper in the chat. And she said that they did look at metrics too at Microsoft and how those align with developer definitions of quality, and but that they didn't add that to the paper, but she has that experience. So I was wondering if you could comment on that, in like, you know, how developers actually define quality, and how this was quite varied.
So that'll be interesting. I'll have to read that paper, because our work was showing that developers are generally speaking agreeing on code quality. So I will definitely have to look at that and see what the differences are in how we analyzed code quality. That
sounds awesome. And this actually linked to also a question that I had, which would have been perfect if Peggy would have been able to stick around a little bit, because I know, you know, even aside from quality, right, she's also worked on developer productivity, right? And I was wondering, you know, how does the SPACE framework, right, that you mentioned, actually, that you know, they use at Microsoft, compare, you know, and contrast to what you are using at Google in terms of, you know, developer productivity? It's very similar. If you read the SPACE paper, I love that paper. It's great. It's very similar to what we're doing at Google. Different name, same concepts though, of trying to triangulate across productivity, use multiple metrics, because you have to, these things are all in tension with each other. We know we talk about speedies and quality. One of the examples that we like to give was actually one of my colleagues' example. He will tell people, I can improve the developer productivity at Google, developer velocity at Google by removing code review. And he says this as a way of making the point that, like, sure, we can improve developer velocity by hugely hitting quality. Obviously, we wouldn't do that. Nobody at Google would suggest that we get rid of code review. And that's the point, is that these things are sometimes in trade-off with each other, and we have to be measuring across all of them, because if we measure only one, we're very likely to hurt ourselves. Thank you for that. And Anita, do you want to unmute yourself, or should I just read your question? So Anita has a clarification question, and she says, could you tell a bit more about the logs data? How were the activity streams bucketed? We don't do any sort of bucketing. So the logs data that would come in for one engineer, we just think of as one stream for that one engineer. So we just then create sessions off of that stream. A session is always a contiguous block of time, and sessions can't overlap. So there's no bucketing, like in a way that you can't be like effectively multitasking. So as an example, if someone is just saying that they're multitasking, and we have seen this in our diary studies, where people say, oh, I was multitasking here. And what that shows in our logs data is we see sessions where they're bouncing back and forth a lot between two separate tasks.
Hey, sorry, my Zoom had run away. I had to find out where Zoom was window. So, but Ciera, you had this light blue one that was way over, and then the deeper blue one where the humans' perceptions differed from, I think, in one of the cases, as an example. What I don't understand is if you have multiple CLs, especially if you are doing this stacking up CLs, how do you create like where people were working on for which tasks? Or maybe
I think I know what you're saying. So I showed you a view of looking at it based upon only splitting out based upon the type of task they were doing. Are they coding? Are they reviewing? Are they investigating? We have another view in the tool that shows which change list they're working on.
Okay. So basically, if I start CL1, I do something, and then I do CL2, that's how you break them out.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Anita, and thank you, Ciera. I think Andrew Fryer is next with his question. Andrew, do you want to unmute yourself? Or if not, I can read your question. Okay, so Andrew says that he expected to hear a lot more about static code analysis. Do you know how your other metrics are related to, say, heuristics about the class hierarchies, graphs of function calls, etc.?
Like, how are other metrics, like whether active coding time per CL is related to complexity of the class hierarchy? Is that what? We have not looked at anything like that.
Okay, thank you for that. Andrew, if you want to follow up later, clarify things a bit more, feel free. Then Sarah has a question. Sarah, do you want to unmute yourself?
She had to step out.
Oh, she had to step out. Okay, so she says she sees a few eye tracking and neural imaging studies that you kept going back to. Is that something your team at Google is interested in pursuing?
I'm definitely interested in reading papers on that, but probably not going to be getting myself an fMRI machine.
Then Marvin has a comment. Maybe you want to read this. If you look for something like cyclomatic complexity, but that is actually designed to measure code understandability, and he puts a link there. So Laura, you're next. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask Ciera the question, or would you like me to go? Okay, so she says, in our work, metrics like method length and nesting depth seem to work better than cyclomatic complexity to assess understandability. What are your thoughts on going back to basics to assess code? Also, what are your thoughts on code standards like AutoSAR or MISRA and their effect on understandability/productivity?
Sure, yeah. So as far as going back to some basic metrics, like just how long is a method, yes, I think that's certainly better than cyclomatic complexity. I would love to see something that more accurately represents how developers are understanding their code. But in lieu of such a metric, I think that I'd agree. Things like method length and nesting depth are probably going to end up being better. As far as code standards, yeah, I'm real big into code standards. Unfortunately, we cannot actually evaluate that at Google because we do have code standards. So we can't do anything where we look at like standardized code versus not standardized, because we do have a very strict style guide. We do have readability. So code at Google is meant and designed to be very uniform so that you can jump into any part of the code base and understand it. And while we don't have any studies comparing, more uniform code versus less uniform code, we do have a study. It was at Icpc several years ago on monolithic repositories, and this came up as one of the benefits of our monolithic repository is we do have a very consistent code style. And developers talk about one of the benefits here being you can go into another team's code base, read their code, understand it, and use it to understand, like, oh, I want to do something similar to what they've done, or I want to use the same API, the same way that they've used this API. So it just helps readability overall.
Thank you, Ciera. Next, we have actually one of the authors of one of your highlighted papers there. So, Dror, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so actually 2 papers. So one small comment is that actually the first paper on your list is also an ICPC paper, but what you have there is the extended version that was published later. So we have three ICPCs there, and not only 2. But the question was, I was trying to think when you're talking about incremental papers as opposed to sort of more big idea papers, maybe the big idea papers or the more important papers, you call them, are because they have some sort of something deeper or sort of break more from common practice. And I wanted to ask you if I mean, you work at Google, obviously, and your task is to improve productivity of developers in a company. So you're obviously very goal-oriented and very, I mean, you work to make things better in practice and one of the things that I always find lacking or problematic in software engineering, lots of people try to invent new tools that will make the world better in various ways, but we're, in a sense, we're lacking sort of basic science that goes beneath those things, and the why of why things work and how people think and so on. So I was wondering if you have any ideas about what is really missing in that way, in the sense of what is the basic science that we are missing that could help you and help all of us in these things.
Sorry. I think some of the basic research that's missing is just understanding why people do what they do, why they make the decisions they make. It's not hard for me to improve developer tools and say, oh, if we do this, it's going to improve the developer tool by this amount and measure that. But understanding, how do I describe this? Yeah, it really comes down to understanding why people are making certain decisions. We regularly see cases at Google where a developer is doing something that is considered to be like maybe a bad practice, or it's considered to be something that's difficult to do. And the thing is, they're not doing it because they're dumb. These are Google engineers. They're very intelligent. Anytime they're doing something that's off the beaten path, it's for a reason. They had something that was going on that caused them to go do that. And understanding why, understanding what was going on in their context, whether it was technical or social, that's the thing that helps us understand how to get them back on the good path. We shouldn't just be beating them down with a hammer and saying like, oh, always follow like the good paths here. We need to understand when they're going off the path, what's causing them to do so. And I think understanding how people make decisions and things like even something as simple as like we're looking right now, for example, at context switching and flow a lot. We've been coming back to this topic several times over the course of the last 5 years, really. Why do people context switch? When do they context switch? What does it mean for them to be in flow? And if people are complaining about context switching so much, then why are they context switching so much? Well, they're doing it for a reason. They're doing it because they're blocked in some way. Well, what's causing them to be blocked? What's causing them to say that I'm blocked here, instead of waiting 30 seconds, I'm going to go and do something else? Does that kind of answer your question?
Kind of, and it's the really interesting thing is that you put an emphasis on the bad decisions. So you're asking, why are people doing the sort of bad decisions or unusual decisions, and which is really interesting.
Yeah.
What are they doing when they? So I just a small anecdote from personal experience. When I get stuck on whatever, preparing a lecture, writing a paper, whatever, I often find myself going and doing other stuff, like walking in the garden, stuff like that, which is completely unrelated. And I think that part of the, I mean, I don't know enough at all about psychology, cognitive sciences, but I do believe a lot in the subconscious. So I think most of your thinking is actually, a lot of your thinking is subconscious. Like when you say that an idea popped up in your head, where did it pop up from? It comes from your subconscious. You're actually thinking about it without being conscious that you're thinking about it. And that's perhaps one of the things that people intuitively take breaks and seem that they're not on their job, but actually they are, because they're letting their subconscious work.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dror and Ciera, and thanks again, Ciera, for the really amazing talk. And